What should we do when we learn that famous and revered figures of the past turned out to be less admirable than we might have thought? Quite a few have now fallen out of favour in recent years. The options are to remove their names, statues and other artworks from our site. We could, though, update information about them to include the complete details of their lives, including the bad stuff. And, of course, we could just leave things exactly as they are, because, well, the world was different back then. These were people of their own times, as we are now. These were the decisions needed by various organisations about the many memorials and tributes to this celebrated Welsh soldier, Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Picton.
Although it is often unwise to judge people of the past by their standards of today, in the case of Thomas Picton, it is a little bit easier. And that's because many of his contemporaries thought as badly of him during his own lifetime as do many people today. Picton had been celebrated as a war hero for 2 centuries, but in recent times a light has been shone on a dark side of his character. It showed a hot-tempered, cruel, and even sadistic man. And it was his brutal treatment of a 14-year-old girl that brought it all out into the open, and much later changed the image of an iconic figure in Welsh history.
Picton was from a fairly well-to-do family in Pembrokeshire, Wales. He was born when his mother was visiting this house in Haverfordwest in 1758. There was for a long time a blue plaque on its walls to commemorate this event, but sentiments about Picton have changed a lot. That plaque isn't there anymore. It has been removed. The Picton family name is well known in West Wales. For example, there is Picton Castle, a popular tourist attraction. There was even, until recently, a Sir Thomas Picton secondary school. In fact, the name Picton crops up in many localities throughout Wales and is usually to honour the Lieutenant General.
So why was Thomas Picton revered for so long? And why is it that today he is regarded by many as an ogre and even a source of shame? Let's look at the 2 sides of his story.
Thomas Picton was undoubtedly very brave and a talented soldier. He served alongside the Duke of Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars. First it was during the Peninsular War, during which British, Spanish and Portuguese forces battled against the French. He distinguished himself in several battles and in one was wounded, yet he courageously fought on. His exploits inspired artists, such as his actions at the brutal siege of Badajoz in Spain.
The Duke held Picton in high esteem as a soldier, but evidently wasn't so keen on him as a man. The Duke was recorded as saying,
"I found him a rough, foul-mouthed devil as ever lived, but he always behaved extremely well. No man could do better in different services I assigned to him." Picton was wounded badly enough at the successful siege of Badajoz that he had to return to Britain to recover. He was made a Knight of the Order of the Bath, a very prestigious honour, and he was promoted to Lieutenant General. He bought an estate in Carmarthenshire and in 1813 was elected Member of Parliament for Pembroke Boroughs. He was successful in his career and wealthy, the source of which I will come to shortly. But Picton preferred warfare to Westminster and was soon back in action on the Iberian Peninsula. He distinguished himself at the Battle of Vittoria. Then, with the Peninsular War at an end, Picton's division was disbanded. He was home again, with the thanks of the House of Commons for his service, and awarded more honours.
It was what came next that sealed Picton's reputation as a war hero. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned from exile and was on the march again, Picton was made commander of an infantry division in the Duke of Wellington's forces.
At that famous Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June 1815, some of Napoleon's forces tried to break through the Allied lines. An urgent counterattack was needed. The 56-year-old Picton led a bayonet charge against the advancing French column.
Famously, Picton was wearing civilian clothes, not his general's uniform.
3 days before that battle, he, along with other officers, had attended the Duchess of Richmond's ball. Strange though that may now sound in the middle of a huge military campaign, it seems that either he had to enter the fight with great urgency or his uniform had not caught up with him. Well, that's the usual story. An alternative explanation is that Picton had, on several occasions, dressed in civilian clothes when he went into battle. In one, he was said to have worn a nightcap. He sometimes carried an umbrella to shield his troublesome eyes from the sun, as well as hats with a brim to reduce the glare.
Anyway, for whatever reason, he went into battle wearing a frock coat and a top hat.
He was leading his men and screaming "Charge" as a musket ball smashed into his head and killed him, as was soon after depicted in numerous artworks. He was the highest-ranking officer to die in that famous battle. Wellington wrote to the War Minister, "In Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Picton, His Majesty has sustained the loss of an officer who has frequently distinguished himself in his service, and he fell gloriously leading his division to a charge with bayonets, by which one of the most serious attacks made by the enemy of our position was defeated."
After his death, Picton's body was examined and it was discovered that he had received a serious musket ball wound to his hip in the Battle of Quatre Bras 2 days earlier. But he seemed to have told no one because he was determined to play his full part in that mighty showdown with Napoleon.
Picton's body was received with great honour in London. He was buried in the family vault there. A Welsh soldier described him as "our commander, right-hand man and the talisman of the army among his men." A grand memorial in marble was created in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In 1859, Picton's remains were transferred there, which was quite a posthumous honour. An impressive monument was erected in Carmarthen. That very grand one became weather damaged a few decades later and was replaced with something simpler. His statue was featured in the Welsh Heroes Gallery in Cardiff City Hall. His portrait was displayed at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. He became an icon of valour. Poems were written about him at Eisteddfodau. And so the name Picton was widely adopted in tribute to the man. There are Picton streets, roads and terraces in Wales and England. The name was applied to forts, barracks, pubs, a ship, and towns and villages as far away as Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Wikipedia gives an idea of how commonplace his name became. In the 1970 big-budget film of Waterloo, Picton was portrayed by the then very famous actor Jack Hawkins. One place where the name Picton became controversial a long time ago was on the Caribbean island of Trinidad.
It was controversial because of his appalling behaviour in the years before the Peninsular War and Waterloo. It showed quite a different side to the man, a side that had long been forgotten.
To rewind to his youth, in 1773, while in his early teens, Picton became an ensign in the 12th Regiment of Foot. A career in the army much appealed to young men with a thirst for adventure. He studied military strategy and served in Gibraltar, where he learned Spanish, which was to come in useful. With family money, he bought a commission to become a captain. But in 1783, his regiment was disbanded, and he spent the next decade back in West Wales. Perhaps bored and seeking excitement, in 1794, on his own initiative, he sailed to the West Indies. He vaguely knew the senior military commander there, Lieutenant General Sir John Vaughan. He made Picton a regimental major. He was back in the military. He then became very active in fighting against France and Spain for control of Caribbean islands, including St. Lucia, taken from the French, and then Trinidad from the Spanish. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and then appointed governor of Spanish-speaking Trinidad.
Apparently, though, Picton thought that his garrison was too small to control the island, so he came up with a strategy that he thought would be the best one to maintain order, and that was government by terror.
It's known that Picton profited from the slave trade to provide labour for the sugar plantations on the island. He took a local mixed-race mistress with whom he had 4 children. The woman, Rosette Smith, allegedly had a malign influence over him and became powerful in her own right, owning many slaves. Picton, the governor, proved himself to be an exceptionally cruel man. According to some reports, slaves were arbitrarily executed or mutilated. Not for nothing was he nicknamed the Tyrant of Trinidad. But word of Picton's cruelty got back to Britain, and a growing number of people wanted him removed from control of the island. A new British government, at a time when the call for the abolition of slavery was getting ever louder, seemed not to want the plantation economy that Picton favoured. So a new governing council was created, with Picton eased from the top job. He swiftly fell out with William Fullerton, the new leader of that council. Fullerton began formal investigations into Picton's extreme behaviour and reported the gory details back to London. Picton resigned from the council and, after a few further military adventures in the Caribbean, he returned to Britain.
Fullerton's account of Picton's cruelty caused a public furore, and charges were brought against him. He was arrested on the orders of the Privy Council and accused of severe punishments such as mutilations and summary executions without any legal process whatsoever. In other words, he killed people at his own whim.
Picton's defence rested on a legal technicality that he had followed an instruction on how to rule Trinidad by continuing to use Spanish laws and martial law, which allowed his extreme actions. The technicality worked. He was found not guilty.
It was a different case that was to make the name Thomas Picton infamous, temporarily at least. This charge was categorized as a misdemeanor, and its details both fascinated and appalled the British public in equal measure.
The so-called misdemeanor involved the torture of a free mulatto, that is, mixed race, 14-year-old girl called Louisa Calderon. She was accused of involvement in a burglary with theft of $2,000, yet she initially refused to give up the name of the thief. So Picton was complicit in a decision to torture her, to make her talk. Louisa witnessed 3 female slaves subjected to the same torture for sorcery and witchcraft. Picton evidently had a deep aversion to anyone suspected of practicing the black arts of witchcraft. The case made headline news. It was a big story. One newspaper stated that it was one of the most important to our national character and honour which has occurred for a vast number of years. In other words, Picton was damaging the reputation of Britain. In a crowded courtroom, the prosecuting counsel opened the case. He stated that a governor of one of our colonial dependencies has disgraced the country to which he belonged by inflicting torture upon one of His Majesty's subjects without the least motive but to gratify a tyrannical disposition to oppress an unfortunate and defenceless victim of his cruelty. During the trial, various accounts were heard of horrific torture, decapitation, and the burning alive of slaves. The specific torture of the girl, which Picton had approved, was called picketing. It was a variation of a military punishment and was, as intended, excruciatingly painful. It involved a person being tied up, suspended by one arm, and made to stand with body weight on a small peg of wood for up to an hour at a time, repeated, if necessary, over days. After nearly an hour of this, Louisa confessed and implicated the person who had stolen the money. But she denied knowing where the money was, and so the following day she was tortured again. Crucially, during the trial, a document was produced in Picton's own handwriting. It stated, "Inflict the torture on Louisa Calderon." It seems that Picton's detractors were determined to get him. Evidence was gathered from witnesses in Port of Spain, Trinidad. One of them stated that this punishment of picketing was unknown on the island until Picton introduced it. Another said that the claim that torture was allowed under Spanish law in Trinidad was false, and his victim, Louisa Calderon, had been brought to London to give her first-hand testimony about her ordeal. Louisa, by then 16, was the star witness, and the newspapers of the day commented on her looks and what she wore, which was a white dress and a turban. One newspaper stated, "Her appearance was extremely interesting, and her countenance, which was that of a mulatto, extremely prepossessing and agreeable." However, Picton's defence called her a common mulatto prostitute of the vilest class and the most corrupt morals. At the end of the trial, the jury had to weigh up the evidence, whether to accept Picton's defence, as previously, that his actions were excused by Spanish laws that he was obliged to follow.
The jury retired to consider its verdict. It took them 5 minutes. Yes, that's right. 5 minutes to reject Picton's defence and find him guilty as charged. But there was no immediate punishment, as his lawyer stated that there would be an appeal against conviction.
The trial had been a sensation. The detail of torture horrified many. Pamphlets were published to show what Picton had caused to be done. A word-for-word transcript of the trial became a bestseller, priced 6pence. The by now infamous Picton got his retrial in 1808. He deflected personal responsibility by stating that the torture of the girl had, in fact, been requested by a magistrate. He got witnesses to state that torture was nothing new on Trinidad, and that the Spanish law did indeed allow it. Supporters chipped in to help pay his legal fees. Picton's conviction for torturing Louisa Calderon was overturned, although the judges stated that his actions were so far outside the law in Britain that he should never have allowed it. The court adjourned to consider what further action should be taken.
And then the case seems to have just been forgotten. Nothing else happened. A scandal had come and gone. Picton resumed his military career, leading to his glorious battles and death at Waterloo. In his will, he left his estate in Trinidad to his brother and £1,000 each to his 4 children with Rosette Smith.
And so, for the better part of 2 centuries, the war hero Picton was memorialised in many ways. Awareness of his trials faded away until, that is, the appearance of the Black Lives Matter movement. It triggered a wave of research and reappraisal. It swept over the names of many of those who had become rich on the back of the misery of slavery. People were reminded of the trials of Picton and the things that he had done. An appeal was made to remove his statue from the Hall of Heroes in Cardiff City Hall. It is, I believe, now in a box somewhere. His portrait was temporarily removed by the National Museum of Wales from its Faces of Wales gallery, but then brought back again with a lot more information about Picton. It has been called a reinterpretation of his life, a youth project with help from an artist from Trinidad.
I would have liked to end this video with some information about what happened to Picton's victim, 14-year-old Louisa Calderon. But after the trial, she seems to have just disappeared from history. Did she stay? Did she go back to Trinidad? I've looked, but I'm afraid I can find no more about the rest of her life. There are, of course, differing opinions of how we should deal with memorials, statues, paintings of people of the past who we may disapprove of today. It can be very controversial, but surely it's a good thing that we do know the full story of Lieutenant General Thomas Picton, a valiant soldier, but a cruel man whose name lives on among us to this day.